All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have y'all. Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project Spotlighting an Author event with Dr. Alireza Abiz. Right now, Iran stands at a critical juncture, and it is essential to examine its history and transformations to better understand the trajectories of its future. So thank you all in the audience for joining us today, because we really hope that today's event will help contribute to that mission. So today we will be discussing Dr. Alireza Abiz's book, Censorship of Literature in Post-Revolutionary Iran, Politics and Culture Since 1979. Dr. Abiz, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. Your book's insightful observations and analysis of censorship and its effects in Iran will certainly contribute to that mission. It's a great privilege to have you here today and to benefit from your expertise. Dr. Alireza Abiz is a multi-award-winning Iranian poet, literary scholar, and translator. He studied English literature in Mashhad and Tehran universities and received his PhD in creative writing and poetry from Newcastle University. Dr. Abiz has written extensively on Persian contemporary literature and culture. He has so far published 5 collections of poetry in Persian, with his latest collection receiving the Shamlu Award. He is a board member in poetry translations at the Poetry Translation Center, and he is also the co-founder of MAHA, a Persian language online platform for art and literature, as well as the editor of Radio No podcasts. So for today's event, we'll have about 30 minutes to listen to Dr. Abiz talk about his book. And during that time, you're free to send your questions in through the Zoom chat. You can also post them on YouTube or send them to media@iran1400.org. After Dr. Abiz's presentation, then we will have about 30 minutes for that Q&A session. And y'all are again free to send your questions in around then as well. So without further ado, Dr. Abiz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Iran 1400 for hosting this event. Thank you very much, Sydney, for your generous introduction. The topic I'm going to talk about, actually present my book. It's a broad topic, and I have got some slides to show you and to talk you through the different parts and chapters of the book. So if you could possibly start the first, actually the second, yeah, and the second slide. So I called this a personal story. And as you can see, the cover of a book. This book is called We Will Return to Pick Daffodils. It's actually a French novel by a French writer called Jean Lafitte. And I think my story with censorship didn't exactly start here. It started a little earlier, but this is something that I remember clearly until today. And it was at the time, it became a big question in my mind. And what happened was that I was a junior high school student in a school which was previously called Khayyam, after the Iranian poet Khayyam, but had now changed name to Wali Asr Junior High School, which is the 12th Shia Imam. And the time was May 1980, so about 1 year after the revolution. And I was 13, I was 12, going to 13 years old. And what happened was that I was reading this novel in the break time, and there were only a few pages left. And then the school clerk came. He took the book, looked at the cover, and then tore it into pieces and threw it in the waste bin. So I asked, why did you do this? And he said, you can't be reading this. This is communist literature. And we are in an Islamic Republic now. You can't be reading this kind of books. This was my second encounter with censorship, which I didn't know at the time is called censorship, but it was not the last one. After a short while, my brother and his friends who had a library in our village had to close down the library and bring all the books to our house. And I started reading all sorts of literature. However, in a matter of months, the fact that we had such a large number of books in our house was reported to the Revolutionary Guards, and our neighbor informed us that they will be raiding your house one of these days. So my brother, my father, and I took all the books into a disused water well, which was running through our basement. So we opened the mouth of that well, which was dry, and threw all the books into the well. I could save one book, which was called Muhammad, Prophet to Know Anew, by a writer called Constantin Virgil Gheorghiu. And I said, this is about Prophet Muhammad, so this shouldn't be dangerous. I want this. My brother also saved one book, which he says is a very important book, and he needs to keep it. And it was the collected works of Lenin. So we wrapped it in a plastic bag, put it in a leather bag, and I took it to our garden and I buried it until a sour cherry tree, which I recovered 3 years later and gave it to someone who needed it or who wanted it. So these sort of things were not unique. Many families in Iran had to get rid of their books, burn their books in fear of prosecution. In public libraries, books were being denied. And also in school, and even later on when I went to university, When I went to university and I started writing poetry, and I wanted to read my poems in poetry readings, very often they would ask to see the poems before giving an opportunity to read. And sometimes if I read something that they didn't like, I would be questioned later on. So then I started publishing, and I experienced censorship. Every book that I wanted to publish, I had to go to a special office to get a pre-publication license. And the first book I submitted for a license, I just received a very short note saying that your book is not licensed for publication. There was no signature, no stamp, no letterhead, just a simple plain piece of paper. And the other books that I published, every time about 1/4 of the poems I had to remove before getting a license. Then I started a small publishing firm, and I experienced censorship in a new level. So it somehow became a preoccupation, especially when I noticed that it is not only for me, it's for nearly everyone. In any gathering of Iranian poets and writers that I attended, one major issue was always censorship. So I decided to do a study on censorship, but censorship itself was being censored in Iran. So you didn't have access to documents, and you couldn't write about censorship. Maybe that's the reason why I wrote this book in English, because a Persian copy of this will not be publishable inside Iran. So if you please go to the next slide. When I decided to write about censorship, I had many questions that I wanted to find an answer. And these questions were mainly relevant to my personal experience. I wanted to know, how will censorship affect the corpus of literature produced in Iran? I wanted to know, will the impact be temporary or will it be a lasting effect? I wanted to know if I would write differently, imagine I didn't fear censorship. And also, what is the purpose of censorship, and who supports censorship, and why do they support censorship? Another question was, if the government will achieve the goals they pursue by censorship, or is there any good coming out of censorship, or is everything only, the way I experience it, is only negative? So my questions, which actually encouraged me to read about censorship and read about the different theories of censorship, always brought me back to one question, and that was the question of definition. I found out that most of the approaches to censorship debate in academia were concerned with the definition, how you define censorship. And that was very, very important. So I looked at all sorts of theories on censorship. The traditional approach to censorship, which saw a kind of binary opposition of freedom of expression versus repression, and other theories like the neo-Marxist theories, the neo theories, the postmodern theory, and all these different sorts of theories. And I found that for my study, that was the situation in Iran, and the fact that I wanted to limit myself to the censorship which was imposed by the state, the traditional approach, the conventional approach of censorship is probably the best approach for my study. This does not mean that other approaches are not relevant or are not useful. All of them are relevant, even in the case of Iran. But because we are if we are involved actually with such a big, major external source of censorship, I thought that the conventional approach to censorship would be probably the most appropriate approach for me. So could I have the next slide, please? So for a study of state-imposed censorship, I chose the conventional approach, which considers censorship to be external, coercive, and repressive, which means it is external to the text and to the communication process. Of course, it uses force and coercion, and it's aimed at silencing the speaker. And then I found out that if I want to somehow talk about my experience and the experience of Iranian writers and poets of my generation or previous generation, those who write and publish at this period, I need to consider the specific historical and social characteristics of the environment that I write in. And this is something that led me to believe that a universal definition of censorship is practically impossible. We cannot have one global definition which will be applicable to all sorts of censorship regimes, because censorship regimes are different in spectrum, in the means and tools of censorship, and they are different, and those differences are actually what makes all the difference. Next slide, please. In order to get to the present time, I needed to give a little bit of history just to put the subject matter in context. So, as you all know, censorship has always existed, and we cannot even think of any historical period with no censorship. But what we know as modern forms of centralized censorship is a modern phenomenon. And in Iran, it was somehow, it happened at the same time as the introduction of press and publication in Iran. So in 1850s, the first newspapers actually were published in Iran. And the Shah of Iran at the time, Nasruddin Shah, he appointed a British subject called Edward Burgess to somehow oversee these newspapers. And in 1863, they decided to establish a department to supervise the press and publications, as the number of press and publications has increased by then. But it was in 1879 where we could say we had the first law on censorship. And it was the chief of police, an Italian citizen, Count de Montfret, who actually wrote this code, and he considered it his own responsibility to implement it, and it was known as the Count Code. And in 1885, the first censorship department within the government was established. Then we had the constitutional revolution between 1905 and 1911, which somehow brought freedom of expression as one of the main demands of the revolution. And the press and publications were relatively free until the time of Reza Shah, who came to power in 1926 and ruled until 1941, when censorship was really strict, and anything which was considered somehow harmful to the king and his rule or to the religion was being censored. After the fall of Reza Shah in 1941, until the end of the government of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953, we had a period of relatively free expression. But after the 1953 coup, the censorship became gradually more strict until 1957, when the SAVAK, the secret police, was founded and became responsible for enforcing censorship. So this somehow, this very actually short history brings us to 1979 and the year of the revolution. In 1979, and because of the revolution, all sorts of control were gone, and all of the books that had been censored or banned during the previous regime were suddenly published. So we had a kind of no control for about maybe a year and a half after the revolution. But then, as the government established its rule, they actually started censoring as well, which I will explain in more detail when I'm talking about different administrations and the practice of censorship during those administrations. But first, let's see what are the laws and the theories and the policies of censorship, which is on the next slide. So, according to the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, publications and the press have freedom of expression, except, and this is very important, except when it is detrimental to the fundamental principles of Islam or the rights of the public. So this is what the Constitution says about freedom of expression and about publications, but it doesn't define what sort of things are detrimental to the principles of Islam or to the right of public. And as you can see, these are open to all sorts of interpretation. And this is actually the basis of all the numerous, sometimes contradictory laws, policies, and practices that we have in regard to freedom of expression. At the same time, the Constitution says that radio and television are state-owned and needs to remain state-owned. So the broadcasting, actually, the broadcasting is exclusively controlled by the state. The other sorts of legislation is, of course, the parliament. And the parliament has passed numerous laws which somehow restrict or try to regulate the expression. One of them, which has been very instrumental in somehow restricting the publication, is the press law and its numerous amendments, which happened during the different parliaments. However, although the parliament or the Majlis is the main legislative body, but we have another council, another body called the Supreme Council of Cultural Revolution. And when it comes to culture, this Supreme Council of Cultural Revolution is actually the main body which oversees the culture, and the way that they make their decisions is that it doesn't go through the ordinary legislation channels, whatever they decide, whatever this committee or this council decides, will go to the leaders, to the supreme leader's office for ratification. So it makes it very quick, easy, and a straightforward policy-making tool at the hand of the directly controlled by the leader. And this Supreme Council has actually made a lot of different laws, regulations, which all of them aimed at controlling the cultural environment. So, for example, one of them is one of these are, for example, the cultural engineering map, which is a major document which was prepared in 2013, and according to the website of the Supreme Council of Cultural Revolution, more than 300 researchers were involved in preparing this cultural engineering map of the country, and trying to make it just try to engineer, as the name suggests, they try to engineer the cultural space. And also one of the major documents, another major documents, which is an earlier one, was a document titled Objectives, Policies, Rules, and Regulations for Publishing Books, which was adopted in 1988, but has since been amended and supplemented, and now is much more broader and includes a lot of other things. But just some examples of these objectives can give you a sense of how vague and ambiguous it is, and how difficult it is for an Iranian writer or publisher to just navigate through this complex web of laws and regulations. For example, this document says that these are some of the things that can make a book unworthy of publication. And this is the word that they use, unworthy of publication. So anything publicizing and promoting blasphemy and denial of religious fundamentals, promoting prostitution and moral corruption, instigating an uprising against the Islamic Republic and enmity towards it, publicizing and promoting illegal and hostile groups, followers of deviant religious sects, also supporting monarchical and tyrannical systems of ruling, provoking sedition and ethnic or religious conflicts, which can bring about discord in social solidarity and territorial integrity, ridiculing national pride and patriotic spirit, encouraging submission to Western or Eastern cultures and civilization or colonial systems of government, promoting dependency on one of the superpowers in the world. So as you can see, these are all very vague and easily can be interpreted any way the authorities decide. And as we will see later on, actually many judges in the judicial system or in the security system have actually used these to prosecute writers. Another major set of laws actually come from anything that Ayatollah Khomeini has said. So whatever he has said during his lifetime is considered law and is treated as law, and you need to obey them. One other major issue and theory, which actually has been the basis of lots of policy making, is the theory of cultural invasion. So cultural invasion, which Ayatollah Khomeini is actually, especially during Ayatollah Khamenei, this became a very big thing. Is the in my view, it's the main pillar of the approach of the government and the state toward culture. So that's actually the main theory which drives all sorts of control mechanisms and also all sorts of cultural production which is being sponsored by the government. And it is so important that between 1987 and 2014, and I'm quoting, actually, I have counted this in the official portal of Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei devoted 97 public speeches, Friday prayer sermons, or other sorts of messages on the issue of cultural invasion. And one of the things that he said, for example, is that cultural invasion acts like a chemical bomb. So it is much worse than open war, because it's like a silent bomb that you don't feel it, but it kills you. And the terms that he uses to refer to this cultural invasion are abundant. It is also called cultural aggression, cultural attack, cultural offensive, cultural destruction, cultural colonization, cultural infiltration, cultural annihilation, cultural looting, cultural NATO, cultural massacre, cultural genocide, cultural imperialism, soft war, and many other words that Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers have used to. And what is this? This is something that they call the Western influence, or the war of the West, on the cultural war of the West on Iran. And it is somehow rooted in a sort of anti-imperialist revolutionary beliefs of some of the revolutionaries, which dates back actually to pre-revolutionary times, in an idea which was called Westoxification, which is a different issue, and I'm not going to go into it at the moment. So if you could please go to the next slide. So now that we know the legal environment of censorship, we should see how it works, what is the mechanism, what is the structure of this censor machine. So the main body which is responsible for censorship is the Ministry of Culture and the Islamic Guidance, which controls all sorts of cultural products. But as we are talking about literature, there is a specific division within this ministry called the Cultural Affairs Division, and there is a Department General of Books and Reading, which in short is called the Book Office, which is directly responsible for censoring books and publications. So all sorts of books require pre-publication license. And the way it works is that the publishers, or sometimes it is also possible the writers, to go and to submit a copy of their book and fill in a form and apply for a publication license. So they can the book can either be passed, you get the license, or denied completely, or very often conditional. And conditional means that they would ask you to do some amendments, which can vary from deleting some chapters, changing some lines, writing an introduction on the book to say that, for example, this book, you don't approve of what the content of the book, or to say that the things that you read in this book is okay for some communities, but not for the Iranian community. So they give you all sorts of instructions to allow you to publish it. Sometimes this process can take years. And when you have finally published, before you also need to get a new license to release the book from the publishing house, and to sign a commitment letter that you haven't changed. The printed copy is exactly the same as the approved copy. So before during all these years after the revolution, this office has existed, and the people who work there, or the censors, are mainly unidentified people. Few of them have been identified, mainly the managers or the chief censors, but many of them remain unidentified. And although the main objective of censorship remains the same, but there has been lots of changes and variations depending on who is running this department. So if you want to be very brief, we can say that after the revolution, in 1 or 2 years, we didn't have much control. And then the war came, and during the 8 years of Iran-Iraq war, we didn't have much publication. The publication suffered both for economic reasons and also because of the war. But immediately after the end of the war in 1988, we witnessed a kind of cultural vitality, and there was a more nuanced relation between the government and the intellectual community, which was partly due to the end of the war, but partly because of the change of policies. And at the time, the Minister of Culture was Khatami, who later became the reformist president. And during his time, although censorship existed, it was a little bit more relaxed than some other periods. And however, Khatami had to resign in 1992 under much pressure from the hardliners. And he was replaced by Larijani for 2 years. But then came one of the darkest periods in the Iranian censorship, which when Mustafa Mir Salim was the Minister of Culture and Guidance from 1994 to 1998. And during his time, many books were blacklisted, many writers were actually blacklisted, and also pressure groups were active. They attacked cinemas, they attacked bookshops, and it was a very, very, very dark period. So when Khatami came to power, one of his main promises was actually freedom of expression, and he was partially successful. So many books were published, but he actually was replaced by Ahmadinejad, who was in office for 2 terms between 2005 to 2013. And again, censorship was much more strict. During President Rouhani's time, between 2013 and 2019, censorship relaxed a little bit, but now during Raisi, it is again more strict. So we can see that although the leader is the same, the laws have not changed much, but there has been some sort of variations depending on who is actually who is in power, who controls the executive power, and who is actually the chief operator of this censor machine. So the next slide, I'm talking about, I'm trying to provide a taxonomy of the censorship. That is, what sort of things can lead to censorship. And this is a very difficult thing to do. And it was a very difficult thing for me to do, because access to documents is very restricted, and they had to go through all sorts of written material and speak to so many people to get some first-hand document. And there was only one book which collected documents from within the censorship department only for 1 year, that is 1996. So it had somehow collected the documents of that year, and it was published during the reformist government of Khatami. And most of my examples and categorization actually come from that book.
Dr. Abiz, if you could try to wrap it up within the next few minutes.
Okay, sure. Sorry, I think I'm taking too long, so I will just skip this, just to tell you that there are so many issues that can lead to censorship of your work, which you cannot predict. So it can be everything from sex and eroticism to politics, religion, lifestyle, and even cultural and technical issues. So the next part of the book deals with two different policies aimed at one objective, which is control of culture. And there are two sets of policies, which I have called intimidation and tokenism, or punishment and reward. And they are also broad spectrum of things. The reward includes literary awards, fame and recognition, primetime TV shows. If you support the system, you will be given positions in the government, lots of cultural organization, cultural houses, which will be actually promoting you. Your books will be purchased for public libraries. But if you do not support the system, then you will be punished. And the punishing would be, if you are a journal, or a publisher, they will deny paper, they will deny to buy your books, they would impose economic censorship, they would actually imprison you, and as we know, even you might get killed, as happened in the chain murders of 1999. So these are the two sorts of policies aimed at control. But one question is, how do the Iranian writers react to censorship, which is the subject of the next slide. Some of them go to self-exile. Those who remain do two sets of measures. They protest, they write open letters, they gather, and they do everything they can to make open protest. But at the same time, they also try to circumvent censorship by underground publication, by publishing overseas, by using pseudonyms and heteronyms, so remaining anonymous, and also by blogging and writing online. And they also try to outwit the censors by using figurative language, allegory, parody, euphemism, quotations, ellipses, all sorts of techniques that are common within all censorship regimes. And if you go to the next slide, I also try to find out how censorship affects Iranian literature. Well, of course, this is very difficult to answer at this moment because it is still an ongoing situation. So we will need time and it's for the future to respond. But some of the influences that we can currently see is a kind of revival of classical forms in poetry, which is hugely sponsored by the government. And Ayatollah Khamenei himself favors that sort of poetry. We could see that some poetry try to get away from expressing anything, saying that if we cannot write what we want to write, So let's just write something which doesn't make any sense. And this has happened in among some poems. But the worst worst thing is that it gives a distorted image of the Iranian community. For example, if you read Iranian novels, you probably wouldn't be able to get a clear picture of the social and political experiences of this generation. You don't see lots of alternative discourses on war, for example, or on revolution, or on women movement. And finally, it might lead to censorship, self-censorship, which is actually the victory of the censor. So I'm going to conclude, and that's the last slide. I just decided to answer these three questions for myself, whether censorship and these three ideas, some people who believe censorship is not only good, it is necessary. And these groups of people are, of course, those who are against freedom of speech, and mainly justified by the concept of harm, saying that freedom of speech is harmful. And it includes it has a lot of supporters among the cleric, for example, or among the authorities, but also some other people as well. The second opinion is that censorship is bad, but not always. And this means that some people believe that it makes authors more determined and makes them go and look for innovative and creative ways to express themselves. And it makes them feel that they are doing something important, which is somewhat true. And a little bit different view is that you have to write no matter what. So it's not that always bad. The third view, which I ascribe to, is that censorship is destructive, and there is no good in it. And the reason of those who believe this is that it's a negation of freedom of speech, and it's a breach of human right. And freedom of speech is not just one right among other rights. It's the right to express and to follow other rights. Also, there is a kind of moral issue here, that surrendering to censorship, even through circumventing it or trying to outwitting censors, is an act of hypocrisy, and therefore it is immoral. And if it lasts for a generation, then it can definitely have some disappointing consequences for the young generation of authors and writers. So I will end this talk by a quote which you can see on this slide by Nadim Gordimer, who says, "Censorship is never over for those who have experienced it. It's a brand on the imagination that affects the individual who has suffered forever." Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry if it was more than I was, actually I talked more than I was supposed to. Thank you.
No worries. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. And hopefully some of the stuff you weren't able to get into detail, and we can go over in the Q&A section. So for those in the audience, please send those questions into the Q&A. I'm just going to make a few announcements, and then we can get into it. So for those who are new to the project, you can find a lot of our videos on YouTube, and this is being live streamed there as well. But most recently, we're working on releasing videos from a series of interviews that we did with a variety of scholars of Iran on the 1-year anniversary of the Women Life Freedom Movement. So you can view those interviews one by one on our YouTube page. We so far have released interviews with Cameron Michael Amin, Haidam Mulqisi, Hoda Mahmoudi, Farzin Vahdat, and Mona Tajali. We have about a dozen more interviews that we will be publishing. So you can subscribe to us on the Iran 1400 project on our YouTube channel. You can also find us on our website at iran1400.org. We have content there in English and Farsi in a variety of forms like articles, videos, and podcasts, where we focus specifically on the evolution of ideas and institutions over the last century in Iran. So check that out if you haven't had a chance to yet. You can also find us on social media at Iran 1400 Project. Also, stay tuned because on December 15th, we will be having a spotlighting an author event with Dr. Arash Azizi, where he will be discussing his book, What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom. So that should be an interesting conversation. And if you receive our emails, and you can also sign up on our website for those emails, you'll be notified about the details for that event in a couple weeks. So those are all of the announcements that I have. Now we can get into the Q&A session. So my first question for you, Dr. Abiz, and I think you were going to get into this more, but this is one that we had to unfortunately not go as in depth into this slide. So could you talk more about how Iranians have been able to evade censorship, but more specifically, in line with the ideas of the Iran 1400 project, how have these methods evolved over, say the past 100 years? How have these methods for evading censorship evolved, and have they been successful?
Thank you very much for this wonderful question. Well, some of these techniques are actually universal. They have been used in other places as well. For example, underground publications, which is similar to samizdat in former Eastern Bloc, became common. Some writers, because, for example, translation was less censored, just because they assume that this is about another country. So some writers have written books and actually published it under an imaginary writer and themselves, and actually assumed the role of a translator. So this is one technique that they use. Also, use of figurative language, which was also common before the revolution. So this is also a common technique. In this case, actually, the readers and the writers, they somehow form a kind of code language, which then the censors also discover it, and then you have to create a new code that will take them busy for some time. Then it is the matter of when after the internet, online publication was a huge thing. So blogging was very popular in Iran between 2003 and 2007, and one of the sources that I quoted in this book said that there were 700,000 Persian blogs written in the climax of the Iran blogistan. And it can be true, because I personally used to write 5 different blogs under 5 different pseudonyms, none of them mine. So one other technique was that I used when we got published, for example, a collection of poems, which we had been forced to change some pages or delete some parts. We would include after the publication, we would add a page, so with all those changes, and we will put one in every book, so the readers would know which parts have been changed. So yeah, I mean, there are many techniques. Most of them are not unique to Iran. It's the ways that people react under all sorts of censorship regimes.
Interesting. Thank you. My next question also is also in line with the project's larger vision, which seeks to look at institutions in Iran. So, what institutions could be set in place in Iran to help mitigate censorship?
Well, this is a very, very difficult question, to be honest, because the way normally it should be civil society, which if the government or the system sponsors censorship, then you cannot expect an institution within this system to act against its governing rule. So when we have had a relaxed censorship, it mainly came from the government. For example, during the reformist time, we had a more relaxed censorship regime, but it was a kind of central decision by the president, by the government. The civil society, well, actually, the writers' organizations, independent writers' organizations, have been fighting. They have been issuing statements. The Iranian Writers Association actually announced a day, which is the anniversary of the murder of Mohammad Bukhtari, the Iranian poet and writer, as the day to combat censorship. So to raise awareness about this issue. And many Iranian writers defy censorship. And also technology, for example, internet and all sorts of digital media, has made censorship a kind of futile and useless action. You would think that, okay, when you can have access to everything online with the use of a VPN, what's the point of censorship? But still, we see that the government insists on censorship, and actually, in some areas, they even make it more difficult to pass the censorship. So I don't know what sort of establishment can do, but I can say some of the experience that the Iranians have had is that they have hugely used the potentials of the diaspora communities. So there are many Persian publishers overseas, and many Iranian writers and poets who are based inside Iran are actually now rely on the publishers overseas to publish their books online and in print on demand, and sometimes they even smuggle it back into the country where it is offsetted or sold on the street corners out of the radar. So these sorts of interactions already exist, and probably if you are talking about any kind of establishment inside Iran, I think I don't think it is doable at this time.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting, but also, of course, sad to hear at the time. Could you talk about if I know that this is a broader question about censorship as a whole rather than literature, but given the most recent protests in Iran, were there any new methods of censorship that you saw related to the protests, or was it the same methods that they've been using for social media since, say, the 2009 movement?
Yeah, again, a very good question, because this is when we get to the question that I raised at the beginning, the definition of censorship, how you define censorship. The way I see censorship, I believe all actions and inactions aimed at control of culture is censorship. Therefore, I can say that the system has used more violence and measures that they didn't use in the past. For example, lots of preemptive arrests. So people are arrested because they might do something, or they are expected to issue a statement. So they are arrested in advance. The surveillance that the regime has, well, it existed in the past. They used to tap the telephones, for example. However, the amount of surveillance and the software and the smart ways that they use to control social media and all sorts of online and offline communications is also more sophisticated today. So I can say that yes, the system has become much more complex, much more sophisticated. They have definitely devoted much more resources to combating the free expression of ideas. And it is not only political content that they want to suppress, they are also suppressing things that you wouldn't expect them to suppress, and maybe they were ignored in the past. All sorts of lifestyle issues. For example, modeling, even hairstyling. For just recently, they have started, for example, closing down social media pages of hairstylists or beauticians or people who do aesthetic surgeries. So these are all new things. They didn't do it in the past, which shows that they are using all sorts of control. And one other thing is that they don't use control only for the sake of control, but to send a message. So sometimes this message is more important than the actual thing that they censor, because they want to send this message that we are watching you, you are being monitored, you are being controlled, so beware.
Thank you. So we have time for about one more question, but I'd like to, if possible, try to end this on a lighter note. So hopefully with this last question, we can do that. While you were researching this book, was there any particular example that really stuck out to you as an innovative new way to evade censorship and to get the message across? Anything that like really stuck out to you or impressed you?
Yes, yes, I could say there is at least one. I interviewed an Iranian writer, translator, and editor, and he was actually a friend of mine, so I knew him before. And then he revealed that he had, and he gave me this, he had a glossary of about 500 words that he used in his translations and in his books, and he also gave it to others, which he believed, and I found out that he was absolutely right, that the censors didn't, because some of the censors were not that literate, so they couldn't actually know these words, and they were higher register literary words. Some of them were obsolete terms from the texts of previous centuries, and they even they didn't recognize. And actually, I used one example. So in one poem, I had the word bar, so the English word bar, which is also used in Persian, and so it was censored. So I said, okay, let me change this to a word and send it again. So I changed this word in the second time I wanted to submit the manuscript. I changed it to nushgah, which is actually the same. It means a place to drink. Nushgah, a place to drink. And this time it passed the censor. So probably he didn't know this word, or he didn't understand this word, because it was a kind of less frequently used word. It was not in the common usage spectrum of words. So this was a very clever idea. And the fact that he was distributing this to other writers and poets so that everybody could use was also fascinating.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like it. And I think that is very inspiring, and hopefully methods like that can continue to persist in Iran. And thank you so much for your time today and for telling this really fascinating and important story. I encourage everyone in the audience and those watching the video, if you enjoyed this, please check out Dr. Abiz's book. It's called Censorship of Literature in Post-Revolutionary Iran: Politics and Culture Since 1979. And you can buy that. It's been published with Bloomsbury Publishing. Also, if you found today's event interesting, you can check out our YouTube page, because we did a spotlighting an author event a couple months ago with Dr. Banafsheh Ranji, where she talked about her book, Journalistic Practices in Restrictive Contexts. This also deals with censorship, but this is more about journalism, less about literature. So I'm excited that we now have both of these, so we can kind of see the similarities and differences there. And other than that, that's all the announcements that I have for y'all. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Abiz, for joining us today. This was a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much. And let me also announce that the paperback copy of the book is also available, which is much cheaper than the hardcover. So maybe some friends would like to buy. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for having me today. And thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.